Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to talk about fueling for endurance performance. It's a question that's come up quite a lot lately, so I figure I'm going to try and tackle it with some simple strategies to help you make things a little bit simpler and make sure that you have a good performance on the day. Before I get started, make sure to hit the like button and also hit subscribe so that you don't miss out on future videos. Generally speaking, carbohydrate intake and carbohydrate usage is going to be the main dictator of endurance performance. Carbohydrate is what we burn to fuel high intensity efforts, so the better we can take it on and burn it, the more intensity that we can sustain. Almost all carbohydrate is going to be broken down into a very simple sugar molecule known as glucose. Now, glucose is a very simple sugar that is broken down at the cell into ATP, which is actually the molecule that causes our muscles to contract and produce force and therefore run fast or sprint or whatever we need to do. Glucose is something that can be taken on in quite large amounts, and we know that taking on carbohydrate and actually consuming carbohydrate is only half the battle. Generally speaking, if you eat more, you will take on more fuel, but how we absorb the fuel from our gut is also going to be a major issue, and this tends to be where a lot of people experience problems. Glucose passes through the intestine through these special transport channels, and basically what happens is a sodium molecule will bind with a glucose molecule and help it pass through this channel. But if too much glucose is coming in, these channels become saturated, and basically we get sort of like a plugged drain or a clogged drain where only some glucose is getting through and the rest is piling up outside of the barrier. And this can cause a lot of problems such as bloating, cramping, nausea, because basically we're getting this big buildup of glucose that isn't getting into the bloodstream, it's not getting to our muscles, and it's not getting consumed as fuel. Generally speaking, glucose is fairly limited in its absorption rate, and this is where the whole 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour figure comes from. But what we know is if you combine your source of carbohydrates and actually have a bit of a mix between glucose and something like fructose, your absorption rates can actually go up quite a bit. Fructose, for example, now has a different transport channel, which means that if glucose is getting sort of clogged up and it isn't getting absorbed as quickly, fructose as an alternative source can actually enter your bloodstream through a different channel, and then you actually get a sort of a higher overall rate of carbohydrate entering the system, and it gives you a little bit more to burn. Fat can also be a very good fuel for fueling exercise, and we have a huge energy reserve of fat in our body. We generally won't run out of fuel from fat, but it is very difficult to mobilize fat and utilize it as a fuel during high intensity efforts like on a race scenario. And while fat is something that elite level athletes can actually successfully burn at relatively high intensities, this has sort of led to these high fat, low carbohydrate diets, and they do have some benefit, especially in terms of training adaptations, but at high intensity we will switch over to carbohydrate eventually. So they're really only beneficial for very long, slow, easy intensity type race efforts, like very ultra type events like ultra marathons and things like that. Shorter and more intense events, fat's not a preferred fuel. It just, over a certain level of intensity, we simply can't burn it particularly fast. It's more of a rate issue where fat takes quite a long time to be broken down, turned into fuel, whereas carbohydrate is much quicker, so our body will prefer it. So while becoming fat adapted is potentially something that's beneficial in a training context, it's not always something that would be recommended in a race scenario.
So, tip number one, make sure to try your race day nutrition. Don't use things for the first time on race day. This is a recipe for disaster. It's a good idea to find out what they're using on course or what's going to be handed out on course, so that if you do have a disaster, like you drop a bottle or drop your gels or don't have enough, that you know which things that you can pick up at an aid station. Sometimes the gels might not work, but the drink might be fine, or the bars might be fine. You'll only know that if you've tried them beforehand. So try your own gels, try your own nutrition, make sure you've played with it, but also make sure that you've sussed out what's going to be on course too. In practicing your race day nutrition, you're also going to get a feel of what you can tolerate, whether you work better off solids or work better off fluids. And this is something that's very important to know, because if you can't really find that out on the day, and far too many people just bring a random sports drink that they've never tried before, don't like it, hate the taste, and start to feel sick, and it's something that could be easily avoided. So if you know what you can tolerate and you've practiced it, you'll have a much better chance of success on the day. It's also a very good opportunity in training to actually learn to tolerate taking on more fuel. It can be quite hard to drink large amounts, especially if it's hot, but you will need to. And this is something that can actually be trained. This is something that in practice and in training, you can teach yourself to be able to drink more and eat more and actually be able to exercise without getting cramp and stitch. The body can actually, and the gut can actually adapt to training. I mean, this is something that we see with those competition eaters who eat like 100 hot dogs in a minute. Their stomach can expand, they can tolerate larger amounts. So can you. So especially when you're on the bike or running, it's a good idea to try and take in slightly larger amounts of fuel stuffs or your nutrition so that you know that you can tolerate larger amounts if it's required on the day.
One of the best tips I could give for individualizing your race nutrition is just that. Individualize it. Just because you don't like a gel doesn't mean you might like a different gel from another brand. And because somebody suggests one thing doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for you. Nutrition is highly variable. It's highly individual as well. So while for one person fluids might be the perfect option, for someone else gels might suit them a lot better. A lot of its taste profile, a lot of its texture. You have tried hundreds of different gels, they tend all to have different flavors, different textures. So just because one gel doesn't suit you, try another. Same with the drinks. Sometimes you might find one that the instructions recommend a certain concentration but just a little bit weaker, and it's actually something that you can tolerate a lot better. It's a lot of individual preference. So you've got to practice your nutrition, you've got to experiment with different things, and you've also just got to be patient and try different things. Sometimes solids aren't particularly practical. Something like a flapjack is something that a lot of people use as being a real typical type of solid food for endurance performance, but when they crumble and flake and you're breathing heavily, all of a sudden you've got a bit of a choking hazard, and anyone who's tried to climb a hill while taking a flapjack will know that it can be pretty dangerous.
It's a good idea to use some sort of fueling schedule on the day of your race also. When you're racing, you get distracted and you can get very deep into a race, not realizing that you've missed an opportunity to take on some fluid or some extra fuel. And if you've missed this opportunity, later on in the race, this could be a disaster. You can't really catch up sometimes. So it is important to give yourself these little mental cues to remember to eat or drink. Something like maybe drinking every 15 minutes and eating every 30, even if it's just a sip and a bite, it does make sure that you don't go too long without missing an opportunity to take some fuel and some fluid on board. So just forming this little schedule can be a very simple way to make sure that you avoid major disaster. It also helps you to stay on top of any sort of nutritional demands of the race. For example, if it's a particularly long or hot type of race, you might need to adapt some sort of specific strategies. And when you've got that fueling strategy in place for the day and you've got that little timing schedule, it'll just help you actually make sure that you stay on track and that you give yourself the best chance to have a successful day.
Keeping things simple on race day is probably one of the best tips that I could advise. Try to be as minimal as possible. Try to choose foods that are compact and really practical. Sometimes eating large amounts is going to be very difficult when you're going fast and having a hard effort, whereas the fluids or gels are just simply a lot more practical and can be tucked away a lot easier. You don't want to be having to carry too much on the bike because it just means that you're going to be, trying to work around all of this stuff and you're trying to find places to store it, and it just leaves a lot more to chance. Same with running. If you're carrying a pack, you want to make sure that it's as neat and light as possible. You don't want to be carrying more than you need. So the more flexible you are with course nutrition, the better, because you don't need to take as much with you. But try and just make sure that you're being sensible with what you're carrying so that you're not actually putting yourself under a challenge of just finding logistical sort of hurdles of actually getting the stuff on your person and actually be able to carry it with you. During exercise, simple sugars really are your friend. They release energy very, very simply and quickly, which is exactly what we want during exercise. Confectionery, sweets, sugary drinks are actually the kind of things that make for really simple nutrition because they provide fast sugars that will get broken down and provide us energy. And that's exactly what we want during exercise. It's not necessarily something we want in our everyday life for health purposes or reasons, but during exercises, these can be really nice, simple options. Quite often those sort of health foods that we use or might associate with exercise and healthy lifestyles are actually a little bit counterproductive and counterintuitive on race day. They can have a huge amount of fiber, fat, and even too much protein, which means that they'll slow the digestion of the gut, and you can actually start getting cramping because now all of a sudden your gut is trying to digest these sort of slightly more heavier substances that take a little bit more processing, and this can actually cost some of the your performance because you become discomfort. Your stomach starts to give way as it's trying to digest these more complex foods. So while they might be healthier in a general context, there's something that doesn't really work particularly well when we're under stress and our gut isn't working quite as well as we'd like to.
So after a hard session in the heat, you're going to find that fluid loss is another big factor. And while we rarely will finish a race fully hydrated, it is important that we try and take on some fluid throughout a longer event, especially in the heat. As we start to get dehydrated, we will start to lose some performance. Our blood is made up of mostly water, and when we have less water in the system, there's basically less blood volume in the system too. So it means that our heart just has to work a little bit harder to get what blood there is there around to get oxygen to the working muscle. So trying to take on some sort of fluid is a good idea to try and help keep your performance up in the heat and when you're sweating quite a lot. Now, water tends to move well with salt, so water on its own won't tend to get absorbed particularly well, but with some electrolytes it will actually start to get absorbed faster, and you can take on more fluid and get it into the system a little bit faster. But you can use the opportunity when drinking to take on some electrolyte and some sugars so that you're actually getting some fuel on as well, so that whenever you are drinking, you're getting as much bang for buck as possible. Because if you drink too much and you're not really taking on a huge amount of nutrients or electrolytes, you're going to find that you just fill up on water and you get that sloshy gut. So when you are drinking, just make sure that you're making it effective drinking by keeping a little bit of electrolytes and a little bit of sugar in whatever your sort of fluid solution is. And the concentration of it is going to be particularly important, and what you can tolerate is going to be, again, quite individual. I tend to water things down quite a bit because I just don't like strong flavors, but every so often it might be handy to have something slightly more concentrated if you can tolerate it, especially when energy and electrolyte demands are high. But generally speaking, hydration is going to be just as an important factor as taking on fuel, but it is something that, again, is going to be needed to get practiced in training so that you know how much you can take on, how much you can tolerate, and what you tolerate well and what you have a taste for. Sometimes your taste buds just kind of get sick of the same flavor, so just be aware that something that may work perfectly for an hour-long session might be something you get really tired of over 6 or 7 hours, and you might want to change the flavor up. Again, this is all something that you should try in training and get a little bit of experimentation with. But as long as you keep some sort of fuel and electrolytes coming in on a regular basis with fluid, you're going to be covering a large amount of your nutritional and hydration needs.
Lastly, I would just say that there's a huge amount of nutritional fads and really good marketing out there, and a lot of the nutrition that we know as fact is actually pretty simple. And a lot of the time when you look at elite level athletes and professional athletes, their nutrition routines are actually quite simple. The products they use are quite simple. You know, you find sometimes elite level marathon runners just have a few wine gums or fruit pastilles and that's all they're using. Sometimes the simple options are actually very, very effective, and it's really marketing that confuses us. So just, realize that what works for you is fine. If it works for you, what more do you want? And you'll only find out what works for you by experimenting. Don't be afraid to try new products and new things, but make sure you do actually try them and that you give yourself a bit of an honest analysis and ask yourself, did they really work for you or are they just popular? And whatever you choose in the end, if it works for you, that's all you want. You just want to make sure that you're able to keep going at your race effort, and that you're not going to cause yourself to feel sick or to run out of fuel or any of these issues. You're basically just trying to eliminate potential problems, and if you can keep it simple, that's usually the easiest way to do that. If you like this video, please make sure to like and share, and also subscribe so that you don't miss out on future videos. And if you have any thoughts or ideas on nutrition or any questions, please leave them in the comments below and I'll make sure to answer them.